Thank you again for joining. Thank you for being here and making the time. This is our second external or public grounded accountability model community of practice session. Today's session will be dedicated to our discussion between Everyday Peace Indicator research associates and our colleague at Search, and all three of them are based in Sri Lanka. They will be speaking about their experience of working on co-creating Everyday Peace Indicators. Shruti and Zara will be speaking about that. And Sadaath, our colleague at Search, who is based in Sri Lanka, will be talking about, again, his experience of holding these discussions with community members and co-creating localized indicators of peace and women's empowerment. So the topic, right, the overall theme of today's session is, how can everyday, or what do everyday indicators and localized indicators say about women's empowerment? Or, how can they inform programming, right, related to women, peace, and security in general? So we believe this will be an interesting session for not just researchers, but also those who are on program design side, those who are implementers and evaluators involved in general in the women, peace, and security area. And we're really looking forward to hearing from them. So first we will have presenters, and then we'll leave some time, right, for the Q&A session. Okay, so I think we'll get started, and I would like to introduce Shruti Deviser. She's a research associate with Everyday Peace Indicators. So she will be presenting first, and then we'll have Zara Rizwan, who is also Everyday Peace Indicators research associate. So the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. As Salkin mentioned, I'm Shruti Deviser, and I work with Everyday Peace Indicators, also known as EPI. Today, me and my colleague Zara, we are glad to be able to present on the research and the work we do in Sri Lanka and share with you our experience with collecting indicators of reconciliation in Sri Lanka. I'd also like to give you a brief overview of what we would be covering in this presentation. So as I mentioned, I will give you a brief introduction to the work we do, the context in which we work, and our methodology, and also the objectives and goals with which we carry out our work and our research. After which, Zara will take you and delve a little deeper into the indicators themselves and the analysis, and also the gender-related indicators that we've gathered during our research. So to start off, I'd like to give you a little insight into the methodology that we use at EPI. It's a unique methodology which has 4 stages that we specifically focus on. The first is developing the indicators. We go into local communities, we conduct focus group discussions, and we try to understand what reconciliation, what peace means in these communities and understand their definition of it. And through these discussions, we're able to collect indicators of reconciliation, after which we go on to the second stage where we verify these indicators. We eliminate indicators that are duplicated, clarify certain things with the broader community as well. And we have a process of voting where the community gets to vote on indicators that they find most important to them, indicators of reconciliation. And our third stage is then we take the data that we've collected, we code it, we analyze it, we look at themes and patterns that we feel are pertinent, and we feed that into our partner organizations so that they can use that in the designing of their programs, which they carry out in the same communities that we collect the data from. And finally, one of the most important part of our process is the surveys. We take the indicators, we turn them into surveys, and then we deploy them back into the communities that we collected the indicators from. And this is really important because it allows us to really measure and understand how perceptions on peace and reconciliation have changed over time, but also to see how effective the programming that's done by our partner organization has been in these local communities. So to talk a little bit about the goals and objectives of the work that we do. Firstly, research is funded by the United States Institute of Peace and USAID. Like I mentioned before, the EPI methodology allows us to understand and track the changes in perception on concepts such as peace and reconciliation. And this is one of our key goals, not just simply to gather the data and the indicators on reconciliation, but then to go back and understand how they are changing over time, how external factors may or may not contribute to that. So that's one of our key goals. And the second goal is then to measure the effectiveness of the programming done by global communities, which is our partner organization in Sri Lanka. They work under the SCORE project, and we want to see when they go back to these communities and carry out these programs, as we do multiple rounds of surveying, has things changed? How effective has it been? Has there been an impact? And can we measure that over time? And finally, I have to mention that the EPI methodology is not a replacement for orthodox indicators of peace and reconciliation, but it actually complements this. Often orthodox indicators are quite broad with a very macro approach, but EPI offers the ability to really zoom in to the issues on peace and reconciliation, go into these local communities, and sometimes really look at some of the nuances of reconciliation and peace and offer up indicators that communities deem important to them. Next, I'd like to tell you a little bit about our work in Sri Lanka specifically. We did our research in 30 communities in 2019. 30 communities were selected. These communities are Grama Niladhari divisions, so very small subsections of demographies. We select 3 similar GN divisions in different clusters. There are 10 clusters across the country. We researched in the northern province where the physical combat took place. We researched in the eastern province with a larger Muslim population, the north central province, which is a border village with the north, and the rest, the central province. We've researched the central province. So we've looked into many types of communities through our research. And in each cluster, we consider 2 communities, treatment communities, where we carry out the interventions, that global communities carries out that intervention, and 1 is considered a control community where no intervention is carried out. So we can really compare the effectiveness of the programming as well. And there are 10 clusters, and in each cluster is based on variables such as ethnicity, poverty, access to resources, the history of violence and experiences of various conflict, and also the makeup of the population, urban, rural, or peri-urban. This way, there is a lot of diversity in the communities that we research. So in 2022, we went back to 11 of these communities. In 2019, 30 communities were researched, and in 2020, surveys were deployed to all 30 communities. In 2022, Zara and I and a team of us, we were able to go back to 11 communities across the island from these clusters and conduct our focus group discussions. Especially, we were interested in seeing if perception have changed because of the economic crisis and the COVID pandemic. And after that gap of 2 years, to see how people are understanding and defining reconciliation and if things are still the same. So that's what I am presenting on. And I'd like to hand over to Zara to go a little deeper into the indicators and the analysis process.
Thank you, Shruti. I will take us through the gender-related indicators of reconciliation that we've been able to gather in 2022. So yeah, I will take you through the gender-related indicators in just a little bit of time, but I would need about a couple of minutes to go through what the analysis process looked like, so we have an understanding as to how we got to looking at what these indicators are telling us. And given that these are indicators of reconciliation, I would spend a little more time towards the end looking at the different other aspects through which communities look at reconciliation, and gender being one of them, one important aspect for sure. So we've been able to gather 1,960 indicators of reconciliation in 2022. As Shruti said, we revisited 11 of the communities to look at some of the ways to understand how reconciliation whether the perception has changed over time, and so on. And these lists of these indicators that are in the form of lists then go through multiple rounds of coding in order to sort of like really break down and understand the kind of nuances, as Shruti said before, and the ways in which communities look at reconciliation. And after going through these multiple rounds of coding, in 2022, we used the code book that was developed in 2019, but then we realized that given that there's been so many changes in the context in Sri Lanka, we had to make certain changes to the code book and recode all of these indicators all over again. So as you can see, it goes through multiple rounds of coding. It's quite a rigorous process, and after which we develop what we call the importance scores, where we look at the number of indicators that have been gathered in a particular category. For example, if the category is gender, one community would have 20 indicators related to gender, whereas another community would have generated 5. So we would take into account the number of indicators per community, as well as the number of votes that these indicators have gathered, and come up with importance scores for each of the communities. But I will talk a little bit more about this in a bit. But let me show you some of the indicators, gender-related indicators that we've been able to gather in the communities that we've been to. So Palavara and Khatta is one such example. Interestingly, because this community is located in the northern province of the country that was exposed to a lot of war-related violence through the 30-year war in Sri Lanka, the indicators that we've been able to gather that are gender related also sort of like reflect these realities that the communities have been through. There's reference to communities being able to take responsibility to protect and support female-headed households. There's indicators relevant to women's safety and mobility, because these were areas that were also under high levels of military surveillance and occupation. So it's interesting how we see this in the indicators that we've gathered. And the score that you see at the top, 7%, is actually the importance score for gender-related indicators that this community got in our analysis. And it's interesting, you see this in a little bit, that this score changes depending on the community. But given the nature of the community, this being a majority Tamil Hindu population, and in the context of Sri Lanka, that would be a minority ethnicity. So minority ethnic populations like the Tamils, the Muslim communities, we see higher amounts of importance scores in these areas compared to the others. And I wanted to also show you a couple of indicators from this community that's in the central province of Sri Lanka. So the exposure to the civil war may have been different to that of Palavara and Khatta that I just showed you. However, Puluguhotana and the next community that I'll show you in a bit are from the central province of Sri Lanka that have been exposed to recent ethnic conflicts, politically motivated and perpetuated through hate speech on social media. And one such community is Buluguhotana, where in 2018, they were exposed to what we call the Digana riots. It was a lot of physical and violence in the area between Muslims and Sinhalese. And in these areas, Buluguhotana having the highest importance score across the 11 communities for gender-related indicators, we see that the indicators from Buluguhotana, for example, having a lot of heavily reflecting the conversations around Muslim women's attire, whether it's the hijab or the burqa, and the negative sentiments that were perpetuating across the country. In fact, after the Easter Sunday attacks that took place in 2019. So the gender-related indicators that we've been able to see from these areas, heavily, it was about Muslim women's attire. And the neighboring villages, for example, Eldapula that we visited, which is in the same province, in the same district, and they were also exposed to these ethnic conflicts, the recent ethnic conflicts. But this community is a monoethnic single Buddhist community, and we see the flip side of the conversations where their understanding of reconciliation, for them, a sign of reconciliation is, we see the negative sentiments towards the Muslims in these, where Muslim women not wearing the burqa, not completely covering themselves, is a sign of reconciliation for them. So I find it interesting that when we compare these indicators of communities together, we see how the conversation kind of fits together. And it's also important for those working in these areas then to use these indicators to sort of understand how to work with these communities and what kind of priorities or sentiments they already have towards women in the other ethnicities that they engage with. Okay, so here is a heat map that we developed to sort of understand the many other aspects through which the data basically was telling us that the communities looked at what reconciliation is for them in their everyday lives. So in 2022, we see that intra-community becomes the most important, the category that gets the highest importance scores, and economy, given the context in which we carried out the data collection through the heights of the economic crisis in Sri Lanka. And there are many more categories that we've been able to extract and identify from the data, but these are the topmost categories, and gender being one of them. And if you look at the importance scores that the 11 communities have gotten for gender, it varies across communities, but interestingly, like I said before, communities that have majority like Muslim or Tamil populations tend to have a higher importance scores for gender. So we've developed things like the heat map graphs as this to sort of understand what the data is telling us. And we've been able to also understand that in 2022, there is more importance given by communities to looking at reconciliation through intra-community, to the aspect of intra-community, or more importance for gender, economy. And we can only see that given that we were going through a pandemic and subsequently with the economic crisis, there was a lot of reliance within communities sharing resources, need to depend on each other, and therefore we see community becoming more important in 2022, whereas in 2019, intergroup contact or public services given higher degree of importance by communities when they looked at reconciliation. So these are some of the ways in which we try to understand and analyze what the data is saying. But moving forward, we also want to go back to some of these communities this year and unfold the surveys, do rounds of qualitative data collection in 2023 and then 2024 again, because we really want to focus and sort of understand some of the specific questions like what do these communities like in terms of Sinhalese, Muslim and Tamil communities, how do they look at reconciliation? Are there similarities or differences? Do they intersect, or do the understandings of reconciliation change over time? So to be able to answer these questions moving forward, we will keep revisiting these communities. And we also hope to conduct workshops in Washington and in Colombo to understand how the EPI methodology, how effective it has been as a monitoring and evaluation tool, and how it can impact policy and guide future USAID interventions. If you want to know more in detail about the EPI methodology and the kind of work we've done in different contexts, you're welcome to check our website where we've documented these in the form of videos and publications. And with that, my presentation comes to an end. I would hand it back to Isaac. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Shruti and Zara, for a very informative, very interesting presentation. I'm sure people will have lots of questions. Again, feel free to be inserting your questions in the chat, but we will have a chance, hopefully, to go over them in the Q&A. So now our next speaker is Mohammed Sadaath Ismail, who is a senior program manager with the institutional learning team at Search for Common Ground. He is based in Sri Lanka. And for those who are new to these sessions, just a reminder and a note that the grounded accountability model was conceived from the very beginning, right, as an adaptation of Everyday Peace Indicator approach. And we have been piloting this in collaboration with our API colleagues and their partners also in Colombia. So Sadaath was actually, again, one of the country team members in Sri Lanka, right, who got to use GAM based on focusing on a certain project. So he will be sharing his experience of how that was done and what were some of the results of that. So Sadaath, the floor is yours, and thank you again for presenting.
Thank you all. And so I'm going to present our search team's experience of, the collecting the the everyday peace indicators, applying this grounded accountability model approach. So I'm going to present my presentation in several aspects. First is I'm going to present about the background of the participants, those who participated in the process of collecting the everyday peace indicators. And secondly, I'm going to present what does it mean for the participants about the peace and women empowerment. And also I'm going to present about how we can act on the collected localized indicators. And also, so those are my key aspects of my presentation. So actually, the Search for Common Ground as a team, we implemented women and girls empowered projects with the collaboration of GAM Foundation, American Bar Association, and Center for International Private Enterprises. The Search Lanka country team held a grounded accountability model informed focus group with the participants of the WAGE project to hone in on their understanding of peace and women's empowerment. This is a brief overview of the grounded accountability model process. As per the target group, actually in this case, as I said earlier, we carried out the grounded accountability model focus group discussion with the projects. And we held the 2 focus group discussion with the 19 women coming from the Sinhala and Tamil medium speaking area. And so we co-created these indicators and actually let the participants to vote as per their choice on the priority basis. And also in this case, we informed a part of the final evaluation and we tested the selected indicators out of collected over the 18 indicators in the survey and key informant interviews and focus group discussion. Actually, the background of the women leaders, for those who shared their life experiences, actually the 19 Sinhalese and Tamil speaking participants were from actually the Ampara district is situated in the eastern province of Sri Lanka. Actually, the participants' background is they are from the civil society organization. Actually, the elected women leaders from the local government institutions and also selected economic leaders. And they are from 26% from Muslims and 42% from Sinhala community, 32% from Tamil community. And so actually, I'm going to, explain, so what does peace means to the participants, especially they have participated in the focus group discussion. So when we talk about peace, actually, it's not just about stopping fights or violence or arguments. It's actually more complex and it's tied into everything that makes up our communities. We have learned a lot from recent focus group discussion and surveys are going to look at the different ways of peace shows up for women participants in the focus group discussion in Ampara. And so here are some, learnings from actually first is the local authority engagement. When the people who make the big decision like building roads and involve using their plans, it makes them to feel part of the process. This makes their community feel more peaceful. And second is the inclusion in international programs. It's also really important for peace that were part of big projects run by international organizations. When they were included, it helps them to feel valued and contributes to peace. And third, the cultural and linguistic tolerance. When it comes to peace, is when people from different cultures and who speak different languages can work and live together without any issues. They say that that's a really clear signs of peace. And the mixed residential living. And also they mentioned that peace is also means that people of different religions, like they are coming from, in the districts, and then the backgrounds can live together in the same neighborhood without any conflict. And finally, when it comes to peace, the environment-related conflict resolvement and also means for them when we can handle. They say that when they handle the disagreements about environmental issues, like where where to dump trash without fighting, that's another sign of peace. When it comes to women empowerment, so the participants of these women indicate that, because we categorize these, the indicators in the 4 categories of pillars of from the peace impact framework of search. One is about a personal agency and resource investment. Second is engagement in politics. Third is leadership and community engagement. And fourth is physical violence and its mitigation. When it comes to the personal agency and resource investment, this means for them the women should have the ability to make a decision and have resources. For example, women leaders should know how to write proposal to get funding, and women politicians should be able to help people in the community, like providing, necessities to those in need. And when it comes to engagement in politics, means for them, women should have a voice in local politics and not be seen as less capable than men. For instance, women should be part of local political discussion and should be encouraged to take on political roles. And when it comes to leadership and community engagement, so most of the women leaders participated in the focus group discussions. The means women leaders should be capable of handling difficult situations and leading community initiatives. For instance, women leaders should be able to guide the community in using farmland during food crisis or start large gardening groups at home. So when it comes to physical violence and its mitigations, they mean that women should be safe from the violence, especially within their own families. For example, there should be a specialist intervention available when there are conflicts involved in drugs or alcohol abuse. Additionally, the police should take reports to domestic violence seriously and have special units to support women and children. So in that sense, when it comes to the empowerment, women's empowerment in Ampara, especially among the participants, about women possessing decision-making power, having access to resources, being heard in politics, and holding leadership roles and ensuring their safety from violence. So there are the key areas we might consider prioritizing when contemplating how best to promote women's empowerment. So now I'm going to discuss about how can we act on localized indicators. Localized indicators can provide us with a clearer understanding of what women's empowerment looks like in a specific context, and also peace, such as in Ampara in Sri Lanka. By using these indicators, various stakeholders like civil society organizations, policymakers, and program developers can address the unique needs and challenges of women in the community. First is enhance their skills. For instance, when women leaders know how to write proposals for grants and secure more funding from organizations, this shows that they have the required skills and autonomy to lead. Therefore, women peace and security programs should incorporate activities that aim to improve these skills. And promoting leadership, when women can voice their opinions in the local government institutions, discussions, and are seen as capable of infrastructure development, it signals their acceptance as leaders. Therefore, women and peace and security programs would focus on raising awareness and engaging stakeholders to ensure recognition of women's leadership capabilities. And third, handling, addressing conflict. If women leaders can diffuse tense situation and guide community members in using arable, the land to tackle food crisis, it shows their leadership skills in conflict resolutions. especially when it's come to women peace and security programs can support such skills and help support women leaders in playing an important role in community level conflict resolution and resolution process. And fourth, with regard to addressing violence, when women are free from abuse and police register domestic violence incidents promptly, it signals a safe environment for women. Therefore, women peace and security programs in future should allocate resources to induce changes within law enforcement institutions for better support and protection of GBV victims. In conclusion, acting on localized indicator of women's empowerment actually allows us to address the unique needs and challenges faced by women in a specific context. With a focused approach based on these indicators, we can pave the way for significant strides in empowering women in Ampara and similar communities. Overall, the achieving peace and women's empowerment in community, such as in Ampara in Sri Lanka, requires a nuanced understanding of local context in dynamics. We have explored various dimensions of peace and empowerment, highlighting the importance of local authority engagement, inclusion in international programs, cultural and linguistic unity, mixed residential living, and environmental conflict resolution. Specifically in terms of women empowerment, we identified key themes such as personal agency, resource investment, and the reduction of violence, physical violence, and as crucial factors. By drawing on localized indicators, we have seen how stakeholders like civil society organizations, government agencies, and local communities themselves can act to enhance women empowerment, focusing on skills enhancement, leadership promotion, conflict resolution, and addressing violence. In conclusion, regarding peace, the participants emphasized that it goes beyond the absence of conflict and involves factors such as inclusive decision-making, mixed residential living, consultation by international organizations, environment-related conflict resolution, cultural, linguistic, and tolerance. Overall, the presentation emphasized the importance of understanding local indicators and taking targeted action to promote peace and women's empowerment in Sri Lanka, as highlighted through the grounded accountability model process and the experiences of the WAGE project participants in Ampara district. Furthermore, as a future process, it was suggested to incorporate the GAM grounded accountability model methodology in program design, particularly for developing indicators for monitoring and evaluation plans in a participatory manner. By applying the grounded accountability model process to program designing, it allows for the comprehensive understanding of the local context and ensures that indicators are relevant and tailored to the specific needs and aspirations of the particular community. Additionally, collected indicators can be utilized for future programs as well. The data gathered through the grounded accountability model process can inform the design and implementation of subsequent initiatives and enabling organizations to build upon the existing knowledge and insight gained from the previous projects. This iterate approach promotes continuity and sustainability in the addressing gender-related issues and promoting peace and women's empowerment. So by utilizing the grounded accountability model process for program design and leveraging the collected indicators for the future initiatives, organization can effectively respond to the evolving needs of the community, enhance the impact of their intervention, and contribute to long-term positive change. Thank you very much. So thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask.
Great. Thank you so much, Sadaath. Again, we've had quite a bit of information shared by all of the presenters. Thank you again, Shruti, Zara, and Sadaath. So now we have the Q&A section, and Pamina has been kindly monitoring all of the questions.
I've been trying to monitor. There's been a lot of conversation in the chat. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the initial questions of people and then allow them an opportunity to add to it if they want more clarification. So the first one that I saw was from Nabil Khan. Great presentation. Given the diverse, disparate feedback from various communities, how do you give policy recommendations to policymakers who want to make aggregate policies for districts and provinces or states? Is it based on prioritization of needs across communities or some ratio given to communities based on population? Next question is from Alex Tiernan. I was interested in your use of percentage points to quantify the EPIs. Do the percentage points refer to the number of indicators per category? What about the change over time within categories, and how do you quantify that? The next question is from Jen Backhouse. Thank you for the very interesting presentations. I have a question on the coding and assigning importance scores. Do community members have a role in this, participating, validating, etc.? Next question is from Mona Ahmed. Thank you for the very clear and concise presentation. I am interested how you went about measuring the changes and importance of the various categories between 2019 and 2022. And finally, from Stephen Wani, how were you able to engage the different groups of the community members in the meetings? So in other words, for those who feel they were more victimized compared to others. So does anyone of those people that I've just read out want to clarify their questions? And are there any other additional questions? Please feel free to unmute yourselves and raise your hands.
Hi, thank you so much for this presentation, everybody. My question was more around, like, because of the fact that this is very localized indicators, how do policymakers who work more on an aggregate level make sense of this data? Because it's not just that the data is created, how do you operationalize it into policy? So I think my question was more around that, like, how do you operationalize the diverse data that you get? And sometimes it might have competing needs across communities. So that is one question I had. I did have a follow-up question with regards to, participant recruitment, because while I was thinking about it, there are many conflicts within communities as well. And sometimes some community members may not be included because of that very conflict. So how do you go about, sort of working through some of those lines of like various racial, ethnic, and religious tensions to include some of the participants? And how do these participants get recruited, given the fact that there might be some who may be able to speak more on that behalf based on, let's say, women? Not all women can represent all women, right? So how does that go? So that's my question. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Nabil. Did anyone else want to clarify their question or add another question for Zara, Shruti, or Sadaath? Alex.
Hi, everybody. Nice to be here, and thanks so much for the presentations. My question is relatively specifically around methodology, but I am really interested in understanding a little bit about that change over time. So most of the presentations were more around the initial gathering of indicators and categorizing those, but it would be so interesting to know how you, because they're very specific, how do you kind of see the change over time with using the indicators that you have found?
Thank you, Alex. Any more questions or clarifications for any of our presenters? Okay, well, I'm going to leave it at that for now, and then ask Zara and Shruti from EPI to answer with maybe some assistance from Leslie McColeman, who's also working on the data analysis from the Sri Lanka side, and then see if Sadaath wants to add any clarifications from his end, and then we can see if we still have some time for more questions.
Thank you, Pamina. I'm happy to take Bill's question. Thank you, Nabil, for that question. Your first question in terms of recommending to policymakers, like you said, it's very true, is a very specific, very local. But at this point in time, Sri Lanka has been, in our research, we've been providing our input to global communities, and it works well because they go back to the same community. So you can be very specific and local. But if we were to then use this information to recommend to policymakers, I believe we will then have to kind of look out and look at more on a district level, look at themes and patterns, because yes, very local, but also you'd find that some of the challenges are similar. Some of the issues are very similar based on their geography and where they are. And in your very important question about how do we recruit, so we identified the same issue when when organizations go into these communities. It's often the same people who get recruited to speak on these issues, the leaders, the people who are more outspoken, mostly men. And so we're very specific that we have 3 focus group discussions: men, women, and young people, who often get left out of these conversations and have a very interesting perspective as well. And then we also hire a mobilizer from the community who's worked in that community, knows the people, knows the dynamics, the tensions, what other organizations work there. And they actually have a recruitment form that goes through from age to education to the extracurricular things that they're involved in, the kind of relationships they have in the community. And we try our best to get as much of a diverse representation as possible. It obviously wouldn't be perfect, but we do try our best. So with the 3 FGDs plus going through this recruitment process, we feel we represent the community as best as we possibly can, given the circumstances.
If I may add to what Shruti already responded, Nabil, just on the lines of how we can use the UPI indicators for policy and for aspects such as that. And in my experience of working with global communities in understanding how they develop programming around it, and that in itself has been a challenge because it's so specific. They've been able to look at indicators in clusters or look at themes or patterns in this. And when it comes to policy level, using these on a policy level, we could see that some of the indicators, though they're specific, they're actually referring to certain policy changes that are required in order for them to see these happening in their communities. So interestingly, as specific as it gets, there's also value in sort of drawing it out and looking at the nuances of like what has to be done in order for this to be achieved. So that's one of the ways in which they've gone about it. Thank you.
Yeah, I would like to also add some points on this Nabil's question. It's a good questions, but I think there are, I think tangible measures need to be taken beyond the everyday peace indicators and grounded accountability model when it's come to, the policy, working with the policies and then the policy formulation process. So I would like to mention a few points in the nutshell. What are the measures need to be taken for beyond this, creating this everyday peace indicators and all that. So the first is, I think, that the policy alignment. So when it comes to the indicators, everyday peace indicators, there should be a review of existing policies and identify areas where everyday peace indicators can be integrated. So ensure that policies align with the values and goals of promoting whatever women empowerment and then the peace and all that. So, and also the indicators prioritization. So prioritize the everyday peace indicators based on their relevance and potential impact. So focus on indicators that can be addressed through the policy intervention and have a significant influence on peace building or women's empowerment process and efforts. And also the one is about the policy development. So develop policies that explicitly address the identified everyday peace indicators. And also there's some major and important things is that engagement of, different categorized or diverse stakeholders in this process, engage relevant stakeholders, including community members, civil society organization, government agencies, and local leaders, and then the policy in the policy development process, and also the developing this, the process of everyday peace indicators. And also there's other things is key, the capacity building, provide, the training and capacity building initiatives to ensure that policymakers and implementers have the necessary knowledge and skills to effectively address everyday peace indicators. This can include like the workshops and seminars and educational programs, so on. So, and also there is a need for the implementation of proper monitoring and evaluations process in order to assess the changes, whether there is any changes related to the indicators and all that. Yeah.
I wanted to give Leslie McColeman a chance to answer some of the more technical questions that were asked. Leslie, do you want to answer those and also maybe briefly introduce yourself and explain your role?
Sure. And actually, Mohammed is the one who asked the last question, right? Mohammed's question was sort of a perfect segue to answer some of the technical stuff and why we do it, which is a really important point about. So I have been working with the EPI Sri Lanka project for about a year now with my local colleagues who presented today. And it was lovely to hear you talk about the work you've been doing. And yeah, so I mean, I guess I'll start with that policy question. Mohammed, you're exactly right. And this is some of the thinking and sort of analysis that we've been doing internally with all of the indicators that we've been gathering now over several years in these two instances, right, in 2019 and again in 2022, is what, okay, so we go and we do these very detailed, very rigorous, very inclusive and participatory consultations with communities, but the types of indicators, and it's about 200 per community on average, that come out of these are different, right? Not only do they talk about different things and they get ranked in terms of their importance by the community, but some of them speak to hyper-local issues that in fact have to do with internal community dynamics that become visible through this process. And that communities can, in essence, act upon themselves. And in that sense, they're useful for really just sort of internal deliberation, right? And we see that over and over. Some of them are much more actionable by sort of an outside entity, whether that's like a local government authority or in this case, global communities, through sort of traditional development programming. And some of them we see over and over really require a higher level of policy intervention. And so it's helpful, this process of even grouping the indicators that come out of the communities into those categories, to think about which of these indicators, critically we need sort of high level policy and political will, and thinking about how to leverage and target existing programs or use them for advocacy. So that's a really, really good question. In terms of the importance scores and all the technical stuff, so essentially, we rely on the importance scores to talk about the relative importance of one theme as opposed to another when communities are conceptualizing and talking about topics like peace, topics like reconciliation. It's a mathematical formula. It's really not that complicated. All it does, it's a way of standardizing and making comparable things that otherwise might look different, because in some communities there's more indicators and there's more votes. In some communities there's fewer indicators. And so really it's just a way of sort of standardizing those numbers so that we can do several really important things that have to do with drawing out those patterns, right? And one of them is seeing, as you saw in the heat map, which communities are giving more importance to gender as compared to, for example, youth issues, or for example, mobility issues, right? It just allows us to compare that. And it also allows us to do what one of the other questions was about, which is to compare change over time, right? So if we visit a community twice, once in 2019 and one time in 2022, we have different groups of people, there's different topics coming up. And based on the rigorous process that that Shruti walked you through, there might be slightly different results of this process. Having that sort of standardized measure allows us to see, oh, well, actually, relative to the last round of thick community consultations, it seems like this theme is being given more importance today than it was in the past. And really interestingly, what came out of the data is that the military and engagement with the military fell in importance. And so that leads us to to ask ourselves sort of, why are we seeing that? And we see changes in all the different categories, some changing more, some changing less, right? But that's the tool that's what the importance scores allows us to do.
Great. Thank you so much, Leslie, for that clarification. I would like to encourage you, we still have some more time. I see that Nabil has another question in the chat. Does anyone else want to add any questions to Nabil's question? And I also invite Nabil to ask his question live.
Thank you so much, Pamela. So basically, there's a lot of talk about sharing, the data, sharing the findings with the very people that we create the research with. So I was just curious as to how EPI has shared the data that they have generated from this research with the communities that they've worked with? I know about photo voice, but what other ways, and how long does it take? Do you share it instantly after the research, or there's a lag when you visit the community again? When does it actually happen? So we'd love to hear on that.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to add any questions? Stephen, if you're still here, I saw that you raised your hand last time. There we go. Thank you. Maybe you can ask your question now.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks to, again, the team from Sri Lanka for that elaborate presentation. My question was on how they went about like meeting the different groups, because the word reconciliation is big, meaning there are some people who were on the other side of the goalpost who feel like we were really put to the corner. Then there are also those ones who were, during that very time, they were on the other positive side. So I really don't know. I'm just saying this because from South Sudan, we have people who are even currently still in the IDP camps and those ones outside. So sometimes when you are having discussions with the people in the IDP camps, you really feel the energy that people express their words with compared to the ones outside. Yes, there are some cross-cutting issues that cut across. I mean, like currently, the current, economic crisis, the IDP person cries, even the one outside also does the same. Yes, and also perception, during this activity, I don't know how they were even perceived in some of the communities. Yeah, so I just wanted to get their experience, whether we are also on the same footing like in South Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. While you were speaking, there was another question in the chat from L. Baldwin that asks, what has been your experience of integrating this data into programming? Can you talk about how that works with global communities, successes and challenges of the model? So I think this is enough to do another round. Maybe we can start, unless anyone else has any more questions, please raise your hands. Happy to include you. Otherwise, we can start with Zara.
So I will respond to Baldwin's question on how GC has used some of our data. And in our conversations from API with GC, I was able to understand that some of the challenges, as I said before, when responding to Nabil, was that these indicators are very specific. So how do you design projects around indicators that are so specific? So some of the strategies that they came up with, one of the ways is that they took a set of indicators from a particular category. For example, if it's economy related, they would take a set of indicators and understand what are the patterns and what are the needs. And then they go back to the communities and co-create projects, sitting with community members, different groups in the community, and then they design it together. So that's one of the ways in which they've been able to use the indicators to design projects. The other in which they have gone about specific indicators that require national level changes or policy changes which are beyond the scope GC can do. They basically use ways in which or design projects that can actually either build awareness or put the communities in touch with certain networks or encourage them to take certain steps that can facilitate the community themselves taking the necessary initiatives to advocate for example, land-related issues, lands that were taken away during the war, and things like that. So surely there have been a lot of challenges in like designing programming around these. And I remember Nabil also raising the point on what about communities that have like opposing needs. In some of the indicators that I showed a little while ago, Aleppo, there's one Muslim women covering their face, whereas Buluguhotano, which is in the same district, for Muslims want to be able to go outside and not be targeted for their attire. And in situations like that, they've been really sensitive in maybe creating programs that are to do with women's livelihoods, and therefore like bringing women from these two communities together to talk about something completely that's economy related, and they're all interested in it because it's related to loans or something of that kind, and then building in certain components of sensitization, capacity building in working with these communities together. So they've been trying to find different entry points, different strategies to work with these communities. And surely it's not a blanket protocol, and it has to change depending on the needs of the communities. Thank you.
Sadaath, did you have anything to add? Any answers to Stephen or Nabil or El Baldwin's questions?
Only one point I can add available time, so I have some things to say. But with regard to the one question about the challenges of this, the GAM process of, the integrating data and all that. So one is about, the key challenges is the complexity of gender and peace dynamics. Actually, the gender and peace dynamics are very complex and multifaceted with regard to, what we are working and what we work with the GAM process. So understanding these dynamics and effectively addressing them in programming requires a nuanced approach, which can be challenging to achieve. That's a key challenge I observed. Yeah.
Thank you. Since we're wrapping up with time, I see one last question here in the chat from Lucas Tamayo Ruiz, who's writing his thesis in peace and conflict studies at Uppsala in Sweden. And maybe I'll just answer this question myself. So Lucas's question is about concepts and overlapping concepts, a concern around overlapping concepts. And I suppose the question here is around whether or not, how we know what indicators are being developed for what concepts. And of course, what we do is we work using a concept. We work with communities to essentially confirm their indicators for that concept. So in the case of EPI Sri Lanka, we worked on the concept of reconciliation. And then, of course, many different issues came up in the production of indicators with the community, right? So we worked with the community members to develop indicators of the concept of reconciliation. But then, as you saw, many different kinds of issues came up, and those were then coded into categories. But all of them were indicators of reconciliation as the community understands reconciliation, right? Whereas in the case of Search for Common Ground, they collected indicators of women's empowerment. And so they were confirming the concept of women's empowerment and then using those indicators to guide programming. They didn't do the extra step, as far as I understand, of categorizing and coding the indicators necessarily using a code book. I may have missed that part. But the point being is that EPI and GAM really allow us to confirm concepts and to validate concepts using community consultation and collaboration processes. And in the case of everyday peace indicators, that's a 4-step process as Shruti presented it. Whereas in the case of GAM, it's a shorter, more consultative kind of a workshop process. So I hope that helps clarify that question, and happy to answer more via email later on.
But thank you, everybody who has joined. Thank you to our presenters, Shruti, Zara, Sadaath. Thank you so much for sharing this. I think it was super interesting, and I'm sure those who haven't gotten to ask their questions, you're more than welcome to reach out to everybody. And we also I shared the link to register for the community of practice. If you haven't done so already, please do so. And you will be getting the recording of this session if you didn't get to see the presentations and all of the future forthcoming sessions. Thank you.